Hello and welcome back to HEMA Fight Breakdowns. Today we're going to be breaking down Zach Showalter. Now, Zach is a very good friend of mine who very recently, I believe, just won Surfo's Tier A longsword. And as a very, very strong, athletic, and technical fencer, I believe that Zach deserves a very, very glowing style review. And that's not just because he's successful and he does very well in tournaments, but also because he exemplifies, in my opinion, a very, very rigid interpretation and understanding of KDF German longsword fencing. Particularly, he utilizes very strong, as you'll see, onsets and bind work, Fulin, and a lot of high level concepts in German fencing that a lot of people find a little bit too mystifying to really put into practice. But hopefully, by the time you're done this video, you'll see exactly why I have so much respect for Zach and the way that he fences. So we're going to start this video the way we always do, with the ringmanship and the pre-fencing. But one thing I want to take particular attention to is that Zach is a very feeling or bind oriented fencer. And that's not something you can say for a lot of people. In the texts, especially the Germanic ones, you see a lot of emphasis on the Fulin or the feeling you have in a bind and its importance in making decisions about what is going on, what is happening to you, and what you should do about it. But not a lot of people like to stay in the bind very long, especially because, as you could probably guess, it's considered a rather dangerous position to be in. So in the normal way that we're going to talk about Zufechten, Zach has a right leg forward stance. He has a more Olympic fencing, linear oriented feet for explosive forward and backward momentum. But one thing that I would talk about with his Zufechten that I don't necessarily get to talk about with others is how he will often wait until a bind has occurred, whether one that he's inflicted himself or one someone has inflicted on him, and use that information to determine from there what sorts of follow-ups he's really looking to get. As you can see here, where his opponent comes at him with something like a little bit of a flurry of strikes, but he constantly holds his blade out and feels the information that he gains from each tap onto his sword and waits for one tap where his opponent doesn't leave the bind immediately right away, and then follows it up with a response cut or a response thrust straight towards his opponent. Even though you might say that nothing really happened in this exchange, you can get a very clear vision into the kind of decision-making process that Zach goes through every time he's fighting someone, where even if he's not being aggressive or he's not expressly being defensive, he's looking for that bind and he's basing all of his follow-up decisions off of that bind and off of the position that bind puts him in. In this exchange, we're going to see what is probably Zach's best weapon, which is the onsets and winding thrust. And I say it's the best weapon because it combines the earlier conversation about extremely explosive footwork and forward momentum, and it does a little bit of a variation on what I would normally call a classic Shield-hau setup. So if we watch where this exchange starts all the way back here, you see a pretty normal left plow type position here. And the idea with this position is that you're looking to just, again, drive your tip straight in towards the left shoulder of your opponent. And of course, the reason you want to do that is because that's where currently there are really two openings, but it's one of the best openings because it requires your opponent to really windshield wiper over to their left side. But what Zach does that's a little bit different here is that right at the point where he is making contact with the blade, he gets this great bind, which is the key to any good onsets or setting on thrust, and that is to have your opponent's weak right here in your strong. Because that is such a strong and highly leveraged position, it makes it much easier to drop the tip of your sword down and, while pushing your hands up into the air, get a very, very strong dominant position where this bind here is going to stick for the entire length of the exchange. And basically, this person's job is going to be to pull their sword back as fast and as far as they can, just to try to get leverage with the bottom of their sword and the strong of their sword onto Zach's mid if possible. But what you see happen here that's a little bit differently, and what makes this different from a classic Shield-hau opener, is that once you get up into the air, what you see is that Zach very, very consciously and very intentionally winds his crossguard up to this 45-degree angle. And this is something you don't always see all the time, because for a lot of people, it sacrifices some of the range and some of the structure that a typical Shield-hau, a flat thrusting oriented Shield-hau specifically gives you, which is the ability to flick your tip down. By rotating your crossguard, the flat of your blade is now pointed 45-degree angle out and to the side, so you don't get that same kind of bend in your sword and that flicking motion that gets your tip on target. Instead, what he does is rely on a technique that we call winding, where by rotating his hands and pushing his crossguard up into this angle, what he's essentially doing is creating an almost rotational force with his sword that's pushing his opponent's sword not only off to the side, but also up into the air. And what that does is it allows you to rotate your hands even higher, and in so doing, keep your left hand up above your right hand and drive your tip down into your target. It's not necessarily the best way to go if you want to just land the thrust, but it is an excellent thing to do if you want to have a good position once that thrust has ended here, which is right as, and again, I don't talk about whether or not these things actually land or not, or whether or not it's called correctly. But what matters is that when this exchange ends, you see just how long, going all the way back to the beginning, that this person's sword is locked into this bind that happens right here. This entire time, all of these frames, all of these attempts to try to get Zach's sword out of the way, and it only happens because he manages to pull his sword out and take the long way around to basically throwing what is a low zwerch or a low Unterhau to the body. And the idea here is that when you throw thrusts like this, you can sometimes get away with flicking your tip in, landing on your target, and then just moving your hands into the direction that you think that next attack is going to come from. But in this case, what Zach does is he sacrifices a little bit of range, makes up for it with his heavy forward momentum and his explosive footwork, and makes sure to wind and zone out his opponent's blade, which in a lot of ways is much harder to do, but can be much more rewarding, because the result, of course, is that once you get out of that position, whether you land or not, you're in a situation where you can completely dictate range and you can limit your opponent's options to wherever it is that they have been limited to. In this particular case, by winding your blade up into your left ox, your opponent really has no choice but to pull off of that bind and attempt some sort of low cut. In this case, a low zwerch. And Zach, knowing this, is freely able to throw a higher lined left zwerch and hit his opponent in the head in a position where there was really nothing else that could have possibly come from this, aside from maybe closing even more and getting into a grapple. With this, we see another really clear example of this winding technique, only it goes to an extreme degree. We see the same sort of bind that you saw before, only this time you can kind of tell that Zach's point is a little bit too far past its target. He's committed a little bit too far forward, and it's going to be really hard to drive that tip back down and properly plant it into a thrust. Now, what he does in order to achieve this is that he sort of winds his left hand back onto the pommel of his sword, takes it into the palm of his hand, and drives it even further down, similar to what a Italian fencer might do in Bicorno. And the idea here is that when winding up, taking a traditional kind of KDF method of holding the sword, generally you're not choked up that far back with your left hand that there's this much grip space missing. But you see, as this wind goes up, and as this hand sort of drifts backwards, you can see the sword continuing to drive down and make that tip go even lower, while the hand, the left hand specifically, almost levers over the top of the pommel and really drives it that extra little bit further down. This is only possible because the wind leading up to it was so effective at boxing out his opponent's sword that they couldn't reasonably pull off and reassert an attack or a cut somewhere else. Where before you might assume that someone might pull their sword off and go for a low zwerch or a low mittelhau. There's so much forward momentum and there's so much forward pressure on this blade right here. I imagine that this person was even trying to pull their sword away as they moved backwards and pulled their hands backwards. And you can see it almost a little bit here as their hands are pulling back and their right hand is trying to get past the level of their left hand, but it doesn't matter. This entire time, there's so much forward pressure that there's nowhere to go and there's no ability to leave the bind. So when Zach levers over with his left hand and drives that point even further down and even deeper into his target, all his opponent really has the ability to do is try to duck and dodge his body out of the way of the tip in the hopes that it doesn't sink in anywhere. And this is a great thing to do if you ever get in this position a lot, where people love to try to wind each other out of a bind, but give up once they get to this point where their hands are over their head, assuming that there's really no feasible way without, getting really close and grappling to free up your sword and get that tip lower. But it turns out if you really dedicate to this bind and to this opening, what you can do is take a little, page out of Fiore's book or Vadi's book and just lever over with your left hand on the pommel, drive that tip down there, and you can get way more rotation and way steeper angles out of your thrust than you probably think you can. So with this exchange, what we're looking to see is another variation from this exact same position, in this case, a Shield-hau. But Zach throws his Shield-haus in the cut variation rather than the thrust variation. And part of the reason this works, I think, for him is that when most people throw their flat Shield-hau, or the thrust version of the Shield-hau, what they're looking to do is to do exactly what we've seen Zach do previously with his onsets and his winding from left plow. So with this, he introduces a variation where the setup can seem very similar. He can start from almost the exact same position, but he can go for a cut instead with his more or less vertical crossguard, where his intended target, rather than into the shoulder here with a thrust, he's actually trying to hit a descending cut right onto the top of the head of his opponent. And the reason this is a variation is because the difference in target means that the difference in the parry that his opponent has to do in order to stay safe puts him in a bit of a 50-50 choice decision. So whereas before, in order to stop a thrust, what you have to do is basically push your opponent's sword off to your left side or your right side, depending on which shoulder they're trying to stab you in. Blocking something coming down at your head requires you to raise your hands up so that this plane, this horizontal plane that you're trying to deflect, can get stopped by your crossguard. And giving that 50-50 means that people oftentimes, when being fed the information of an explosive forward footwork with the right foot forward and a bit of a lunge, they don't necessarily know for sure whether or not this is the winding stab that we saw before, or this is the Shield-hau that we're seeing now. And that specific interaction opens up targets that wouldn't normally be there. Now, you see here, the opponent here went for the exact kind of defense that you would expect for a stab. They windshield wiper their blade with their horizontal crossguard over to their left side to protect this shoulder. In so doing, they pulled it back and they protected it well. But you can see right here, Zach's blade is right at the level of his head. And while I believe that this particular shot might have missed a little bit, you can see also that the bind that Zach has ended up in is, again, very favorable. He has his strong right against his opponent's weak. So even if this descending cut had not missed, it would have landed right on the top of his opponent's head, and it wouldn't have had any bind presence to stifle any of its momentum. So it was a very, very good, strong opener, and one that blends like basically seamlessly with the stab that we saw earlier. With this exchange, we see something that I've actually made a video about before, which is Zach's unique way of doing what I guess I would call a zornort. And in particular, it has everything to do with this guard you see Zach in here. Most people wouldn't call it a Vomtag because it's not up here by the shoulder. Most people wouldn't call it a left or right plow because it's really not aligned with either of his hips. His sword is sort of pointed out, erroneously off towards his right side. But the reason he does this is that he's essentially baiting his opponent into going into a more long point oriented guard here, where their blade is easily aggressed and easily interacted with. And the reason he's looking for that is because from this position and from this guard, what he does is he essentially zorns into a kind of Shield-hau thrusting onsets in position. Now, I know it's a lot of things to say at once, but if you go back here, you see that his blade is pointed, again, out to this right side. And as he's coming forward, he's essentially doing what you would call in Olympic fencing a beat attack, where he's using that little bit of space he gave himself to tap his opponent's blade just a little bit out of measure here. And on top of all the other things that go into a good Shield-hau and a good onsets and a good wind, that little extra tap helps give him the bite and the bind and the position that he needs to ensure that this doesn't just end, in a double stab, as happens so often with two people who have point forward orientations of their blade. So if we go back and watch it one more time, you see this intentional tapping of the sword right as his opponent just attempts to thrust straight forward, but there's nowhere to go because that little bit of tap right as the blades meet ensures that his opponent's blade, as it's driving forward, just harmlessly glances up and off to Zach's left side. But it happens so quickly that there's really no time for the person throwing the counter thrust on the opposite side of Zach to reorient their point or take account for what kind of bad bind they've accidentally put themselves into. Here we see Zach utilizing a favorite technique of mine, which is the defensive left zwerch. And he uses it at the perfect time, which is right here when his opponent dedicates a huge amount of force and momentum and distance to a flicking Shield-hau into his left shoulder. Now, luckily, he manages to get his crossguard in the correct place and enough forward and upward pressure that the sword kind of harmlessly bounces off due to the flat nature. But this is probably all according to plan for this person here. They didn't necessarily want to enter in and land that Shield-hau first intention, though that would have been nice. What they were really looking to do is bounce their blade off of Zach's guard and throw a follow-up right zwerch that would come too quickly to defend. But one thing that Zach did, and the setup for it was all the way back at the beginning at the bind here, is that when he deflected this cut, he did it with his thumb on the back of the sword with his flat oriented forward towards his opponent, which actually put him in a perfect position to immediately just rip his left hand across his right hand and throw that perfect defensive left zwerch. And as I say in other videos, one of the great things about the left zwerch is that you can do it with crossed hands and with the crossguard oriented directly in front and in the way of anything that comes in from your top right area. So it's a great tool for defending the left side of your head from your opponent throwing a right zwerch at your head, all while having your hands pulled back so that the normal ability for someone to stuff a right zwerch, meaning they drive even further forward and try to shove their hands into your hands, is limited because the cross-handed guard naturally pulls your right hand, which is right here, back towards the right side of your body, towards the right side of your ear, really. And that backwards momentum with your right hand means that if someone shoves their hand into your right hand, well, they're not actually stuffing the strike. With a right zwerch, your right hand has to come forward in order to deliver strength and momentum and structure. But with the left zwerch, it's pulling back, and it's your left hand, in fact, that's kind of moving forward for the first half of the technique. So stuffing it requires a completely different setup, and as such, you're in a very, very safe position where regardless of whether or not your opponent closes too deep or stays at this range, you can throw this well-defended strike, hit the target that you want to hit while defending the target that inevitably your opponent was going for in the first place, namely your head. So here we see that thanks to how quickly this person tried to throw their right zwerch, they kind of throw it a little bit flat, although it sort of seems like it might have reoriented itself after it hit Zach's crossguard here. But the reason it hits his crossguard and the top of his blade is, of course, because rather than throwing a right zwerch off of this, which would have ended in them both doubling each other almost uncertainly. But the fact that this crossguard is here in the way is, again, specifically because the left hand is moving forward here. And as the crossguard comes in alignment, it's rotating in a kind of circular motion around the top of your hands and around the top of your head. So this momentum here, as the crossguard swings from the right side of your body to the left side of your body, is perfect for putting just enough, basically, oppositional force into your opponent's cut while putting the crossguard, the part that's supposed to defend you, right in the way of anything that would be coming here, or even a little bit upwards here into the head, and putting that defensive measure right there so that you don't get hit by this first intention. Someone has to instead pull off and go lower. They have to go for your hips or your legs or maybe your elbow. And what that means is that if you throw a good defensive left zwerch here, you can almost assure yourself that if they go low, well, they're going to get hit in the head. And sometimes you have to make sure that someone is going to be punished for going to a lower priority target, regardless of whether or not the rule set says it's worth the same amount of points or not. And most importantly, it defends your head, which means that, again, regardless of the rule set, you're defending the most important part of your body with arguably one of the least important parts, which is your forearms and hopefully not your hands, though we have very bulky gloves on and sometimes they get hit anyway. But the cross guard's there to defend your hands and your head and your forearms a little bit. So if you get something in the shoulder or the elbow or the ribs or the hip or even the leg, sometimes you gotta throw the move that maybe won't keep you perfectly safe from everything, but will keep you safe from the most important things while delivering a strike to the most important thing of your opponent. And here we see this exact same scenario play out again. The flicking thrust from his opponent, the high line parry, the defensive left zwerch, all playing out perfectly so that his opponent, unwilling to make the sacrificial play and go for a lower opening, tries desperately to reassert his point and get another thrust, but there really just is nowhere to go. So another clean left zwerch off of a overcommitted or, reasonably committed thrust from his opponent. With this exchange, what we're going to see is how Zach responds particularly to hand snipes. And that is basically to turn your opponent's hand snipe into a bit of a zorn, where you trick your opponent by having them fish for your hands into throwing an attack that's a little bit too strong at your blade instead, by basically extending your blade out, giving them something to hit. This is a unique technique that I think you really only talk about in Myers Provoker Taker Hitter, where your intention is to throw something where you're not trying to hit your opponent, you're not trying to defend an attack from your opponent. What you're trying to do is get your opponent's mind to go through his natural motions and to continue to the next stage of the play and the next stage of the sequence that he's trying to perform. Here you see he tries to go for this hand strike and immediately pulls off of the blade to throw something else. More importantly, he pulls off of the blade first to parry the follow-up cut that he believes is coming. And by allowing him to have something to hit all the way back here, Zach basically tricks his opponent into giving him momentum into his sword and to speed up the responding attack that he throws afterwards, which in this case skips the hang and parry stage and goes straight to what is basically either an Oberhau or you could say a low zwerch onto his opponent's arm. The reason this works so well isn't just because, anytime someone misses a cut to your hands, you can immediately throw one back, but particularly because he had forced his opponent to continue the sequence of his hand shot play in knowing basically where he was going to be afterwards. Because immediately after missing that shot, the fighter on the right here understood that a follow-up attack was going to come, but because they had struck Zach's blade so hard, they had inadvertently added momentum to his follow-up strike and made it that much more difficult and that much more fast. So that is how you can manipulate your opponent with kind of mind games like this to open up targets that they wouldn't normally want you to have. All right, that's going to be it for today. If you'd like to see your own footage featured on the channel, feel free to send an email over to HEMAFightBreakdowns@gmail.com, and I hope to see you next time.